Okay. What we're going to do now to try and get a bit of conversation going is we'll talk about functional languages, because I know that there are at least two other people here interested in functional languages. So a functional language is one where there are no assignment statements. There are only initialization statements. And that means that when you write a functional program, you might say, you might have three statements: A equals B plus 1, C equals A plus 3. Well, that's a problem because you've got a loop. But if you initialize A, B, and C in terms of themselves, and there are no loops, you can put them in any order, and the document compiler will figure out the right order. So what that means is that you can pretend that things exist and fill them in later. So an Elm program typically starts with sandbox, which is passed a record which has a value for init, a value for update, and a value for view. And you write sandbox, init equals init, view equals view, sandbox equals sandbox, even though those values haven't been defined. And then later you define them. So as you need something, you can introduce it and define it later. So you say, put the cake in the oven. And the fact that you haven't explained to the computer what the cake is and what the oven is doesn't matter. It doesn't stop you saying that. It just means that you owe them the definition of cake and oven, and you're going to provide it later. So you can put the commands in any order you want. The absence of assignments means you don't have side effects, and it avoids quite a lot of bugs. And Phil and myself and Jim, all do functional programming, one in Haskell and two in Elm. And would Phil like to say something?
I'll just say a couple of words. I'm mainly involved in teaching with Open University courses, which, as they would be, are oriented towards Java and Python, and are quite traditional. But the description you gave of functional programming, I think sounds a bit like abstention. I'd rather describe functional programming as essentially syntactic sugar for the lambda calculus extended with a strong type system. And the other point I would make is that whilst Alan Turing is famous for the eponymous Turing machine, the bloke ought to be famous for the appendix to his 1934 paper, because it was the appendix that demonstrated that the lambda calculus and his eponymous Turing machine had equivalent calculational power. Now, of course, what happens since then is what languages give you the most expression, the most expressiveness, and that, of course, is controversial. Historically, over the last 30 years, whilst functional languages have become reasonably quick, there is still a resistance in the marketplace to them. Back in 1983, Alan Perlis wrote a lovely paper called Epigrams on Programming, and he pinched one from Oscar Wilde, but slightly changed it to say that functional programmers know the value of everything, but the cost of nothing. Because, of course, about 30 years ago, functional languages were quite slow, but that's probably not true anymore. So, it's a culture thing. It's a culture thing. What it tends to happen, though, is that if you look at my notes on Python, I teach it as if I translated everything from Haskell, because I can't stand Python or Java. I mean, Java's just crazy. Okay, back to you, Jonathan.
Do you want to put in a few words, Jim?
Yeah, sure. So my contact with functional language is twofold. One is, of course, I'm a mathematician, and functions are quite natural to mathematicians. I've used a particular functional language called Elm to write an interactive LaTeX system, which is hosted by a web app. And I found it quite pleasant to develop in this language because, on the one hand, it's a language that is designed for building web apps. And on the other hand, it has a very nice parser library, which allows me to rather quickly cook up a parser for a subset of LaTeX. So that's my contact with it.
Thank you, Jim. A quick postscript, which is that Alan Jeffrey wrote some TeX macros that implement the lambda calculus using the macro expansion language that TeX does, so to speak, in its mouth. In other words, without using assignments like def, it's just macro expansion. So a macro expansion in the TeX language is very, very powerful. And that's got a relationship to processing TeX documents to multiple outputs. Because if the document relies on that macro expansion language, you either have to process it using TeX, or you have to emulate that in whatever else you're doing to process the document.
Jonathan, I'd just like to add that at the very beginning of the session, I posted a link to something somebody forwarded to me a couple of weeks ago about converting LaTeX documents to EPUB. So that might be useful for some people.
Okay.
I'll repost it now because it's probably gotten lost in the stream.